Well, hello and welcome everybody to our webinar, 2021, Business Steps Up to the Climate Challenge. I'm Dorothy Maxwell. I'm Senior Director of Sustainability at Davy Horizons. And I'm delighted to be joined by our guest speaker, Nigel Topping, the United Nations High-Level Climate Action Champion at COP26. Nigel, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. You got the whole title in without stumbling or without
It
pause.
is some title.
That's a first. It's some title.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you, and you're well.
Yeah, very well. I'm delighted to join you.
Super. So let me set the context for our discussion and also just set a little bit of housekeeping for all those who are joining us so you understand the format for today. Our aim is to raise awareness, especially for those of you who are businesses, on both the risks but also the opportunities as we shift to a low carbon economy. So whether your business is at the beginning or you're advanced on climate change, our intent today is that the discussion will have insights to support you progress. Our entry point to this discussion is this. It's been 5 years since the adoption of the United Nations Paris Agreement on climate change. And the world is heading for a 3 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature by 2050. The science is clear. To avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the bottom line is we have a major overshoot. And to achieve that 1.5, global greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced to 55% by 2030, reaching net zero by 2050. With the run-up to the next major climate summit, the UN COP26 summit, and if you're not familiar with the word COP, it means Committees of the Parties, that summit is happening this November in Glasgow. And at it, governments and businesses are focusing in on one target, achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by latest 2050. And that's the reason why you've seen a lot of commitments out there on this in the last couple of months. To get to net zero by 2050, we need to be on this now and taking action this decade. So today we're going to discuss where we're at on this topic, how business can engage, and how business can use the COP26 campaign Race to Zero that Nigel is championing to move forward. Our team in Davy Horizons have produced a white paper on all the topics that we're covering today. We'll circulate it later this week. And it includes inputs from key government and business stakeholders. And it also has case examples from businesses, both large and small, that are already successfully innovating in the low carbon economy across sectors like renewable energy, sustainable food and farming, green buildings, and electric vehicle transport. And we hope that that's a helpful resource. Little bit of housekeeping. You'll have noted by now, everybody is on mute. Our discussion is going to last about 40 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes for Q&A. So I would ask you, we have a lot of people with us today. Please add your questions to the chat box as we go. Many of you have also submitted questions in advance, so many thanks for that, and we will take those as well. Finally, if you want to use social media, the hashtag is here behind me, hashtag Race to Zero. Okay, Nigel, I'm going to introduce you to our audience because you have a very impressive resume. Not only are you the current UN high-level climate action champion, I got it again, but previously you've been CEO at We Mean Business, and you've been driving climate action in some of the world's most influential businesses for years. You've also been executive director at CDP, over 20 years now, driving disclosure across carbon, supply chains, water, forests. You have 18 years experience yourself in the private sector, and you're also on some very influential committees like the Energy Transitions Committee. So knowing you for many years myself, Nigel, I have to say COP26 is incredibly lucky to have you. Tell us about the Race to Zero business campaign that you're championing there.
Great. Well, thank you, Dorothy, for that very kind introduction. So this long title that I have, I should explain that the role was created as part of the Paris Agreement because the 190 plus countries who signed the Paris Agreement, in that process recognized, I think this is important because there's real humility in this. The countries, the national governments recognize this is such a big deal, they can't do it on their own. So they asked each country who comes in as president of the process, like many multilateral processes, has a different country presides over each year. So this year it's the UK, to appoint somebody with this fancy title, but to be responsible for working with everybody else who's not a national government. So what the UN system calls non-state actors, so businesses, investors, cities, and regions, to drive ambition and action. And so I'm working with Gonzalo Munoz, who's the Chilean high-level champion, because Chile at the presence of COP25. And then after COP26, I'll work with an African high-level champion, because an African country, we don't know which yet, will run COP27. But you're right, this is the big deal, COP26, because it's the first real test of the Paris Agreement. So Gonzalo and I last year decided we wanted to really give more emphasis on the momentum that is building amongst private sector and local governments, particularly around commitments to get to zero. So first of all, Race to Zero is just an umbrella campaign that brings in lots of initiatives that businesses, investors, and cities in particular, with the objective of making sure that policymakers all over the world hear loud and clear that everybody gets it, understand the science. We know now this is an inevitable transition, because we know macroeconomically it's much better for us to make the transition than to not make it. As we say, the cost of action is much less than the cost of inaction. And momentum has built in the last 2 years since the scientific report in 2018, which looked at the difference between getting to net zero in 2050 and getting to net zero in 2070. And basically it said in the starkest terms, every year means more economic damage and more human suffering around the world. So what we're trying to do with the Race to Zero is very simply motivate as many people as possible to say, we're in the race, we're committed, but in a rigorous way, because as with all bold statements in life, they can be meaningful or they can be flaky. So what we do is we've got quite a rigorous process with some scientific experts of only including in the campaign initiatives which meet 4 criteria. First of all, they require companies, in this case, to set a clear long-term target to get to net zero by 2050 at the latest. We call it a race for a reason. I'll come back to that about how much faster I think we might be able to do it. That they then make a plan for the short term. So it's not a CEO. You know, if I was a CEO of a business today, age 55, then making a commitment for 2045 would be something that I'd be passing on to probably 3 CEOs down the line, right? So it's pretty meaningless. But if I say this is what we're going to do in the next 4 years by 2025 with a plan and capex and operational measures, then you can hold me accountable to it. So it's a long-term pledge and a short-term plan, and then the commitment to get on with it and to publish progress. We call those the 4 Ps, you know, pledge, plan, progress, and publish.
Perfect. That's clear.
And so we've got, and so far there's, I mean, the momentum is really incredible. Like everybody's I think everybody's realizing that the science is now really clear. You can see it's not the science about what's going to happen somewhere else in 10 or 20 years time. It's the science explaining what's happening today in California and Australia and Mozambique and Japan and in the UK and the Ireland with, you know, more extreme weather and floods. And also we can start to be more confident that we know how to get there because the technology costs are coming down. And again, it's one of those things where the more people are in, the faster we go. So at the top level, it's just this overall campaign to get as many as possible. But then we're also working in every sector to work with all the experts from different sectors to say, what is the pathway to get to zero in every sector? And the good news is we know how to get to zero in every single sector. And there are businesses committed to getting to zero by 2050, 2045, 2040 in every single sector. And what we're trying to do then is really focus attention on the short term of getting a critical mass of businesses. So we call it, if we've got 20% of the major players in any sector committed to zero, then you know the race has really started. And then what is the actual real economy targets we need to get to in, say, 2025 to know that we're making fast enough progress. So we call those the Race to Zero breakthroughs.
Okay, so this is to me really focused, and that's quite different than what we've seen for business at previous COPs. And if we take a step back, so the sectors with the biggest impacts from a climate change perspective, fossil fuel energy, transport, agriculture, the built environment, and then we have these hard to abate carbon intensive sectors, aviation, cement, and so forth. You talked about the breakthroughs and trying to speed up and scale the change for particularly those hard to abate sectors? Break that down a little bit more for us. What's available through Race to Zero for those sectors? How does it work?
So let me use two different examples to kind of illustrate that the fact what we know that different sectors are at different stages. So what we try and do is put the S curve at the heart of this narrative, because we know, because we've seen this movie 100 times before, that industrial transformation doesn't follow a straight line, it follows an S curve. It takes forever to get going, then it goes exponential, and then it reaches market saturation. So whether that's from horses to cars, or from valves to transistors, or from landlines to mobile phones, we've seen that movie. But policymakers and businesses and investors often forget that, which means that they end up getting disrupted and being surprised and losing market share. So you can see that with electric utilities, very mature now. A lot of value was lost by investors not seeing that coming. So we end up having to split electric utilities into good co, bad co, and you've got now a new set of electric utilities. And in many cases, they're competing with oil and gas companies. So, famously, we see now companies like Ørsted and Iberdrola with higher valuations than some of the oil majors. No one would have believed that 10 years ago. But a lot of asset managers have lost a lot of money for pension funds. Again, there's a problem with the metrics. If you benchmark against your peers and all of your peers are losing money for the beneficial owners, then nobody loses out except the pensioners, right? It's a real problem with a sort of mean reversion approach to measuring rather than looking at absolute returns and people's real fiduciary jobs. We could come back to that. Electric vehicles is the next one, right? 5 years ago, I remember I was actually placing, there's a website called Long Bets. I made a bet that by 2029, one of the world's major vehicle manufacturers would have stopped producing internal combustion engines. Everyone thought I was completely crazy. I got abusive emails telling me how stupid I was and how I didn't understand engineering. Well, guess what? Volvo have just said 2030, Ford in Europe 2030, GM 2035. So that's because people underestimate the power of innovation and all these feedback loops between policy, consumer demand, technology, growing confidence, so that we go up that S curve. So, and then another example would be green hydrogen, which is way earlier, right? So that's not like
but growing quickly, and a lot of discussion about it.
A lot of discussion about it, but to try and really focus that, we launched the Green Hydrogen Catapult last year with 7 majors. Some energy, like also Yara, fertilizer company, know a lot about hydrogen and ammonia. So in terms of being really focused on a breakthrough, we need to get to 25 gigawatts of green hydrogen electrolysis to get to about $2 a kilogram green hydrogen, which then makes green hydrogen competitive with fossil fuels for certain applications. So is that degree of focus that we need. Like, what do we actually need to deploy? And then from that, you can work back in how much capex do we need and what policies do we need, and you can start to add up all the commitments and have we got enough momentum in the pipeline to feel
okay
that we're going to get. So we try and do that for every sector.
Okay, so you're bringing the actors together. You're providing the blueprint, the playbook for them to scale.
Yeah, and what interestingly, under a sort of global industrial economy that was dominated by sort of Reagan Thatcher economics of just leave the market to sort everything out, where industrial strategy was kind of a sort of communist plot, right? We're seeing the industrial strategy is back in fashion because countries are realizing that if you don't direct development of your industry, then those who do direct it will win, especially in a time of disruption. And what we're also seeing come back in fashion is collaboration. We see this in technical sectors who have very fast innovation cycles. So like telephony, I always use the example, we're moving from 4G to 5G, but that industry's already defined the 6th generation of technology and is working on what the 7th generation will be. And that's what we're seeing across steel, cement, shipping, is that actually whole sectors need to agree the kind of pace and shape of the major milestones of technical development so that we can actually pre-competitively agree that and therefore move faster together with less risk for everybody. That's why, for example, you see even BP and Shell calling on the UK government to ban combustion engines early, because people want to get rid of the uncertainty, because uncertainty means wasted capex, right? When we know there's a disruption.
You get the right market conditions. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's take a step back for people who are joining us today who may not be familiar with the term net zero. When we talk about this concept of reaching net zero by 2050, it sounds daunting. It sounds very far away. How do you articulate net zero emissions?
Well, the main thing to understand is basically for most people it means zero. Don't get too excited about the get out of jail free card of net. So let me explain that. So it comes from the fact that some of our economic activity we don't currently know how to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. The classic would be livestock rearing, where ruminants produce methane. People like to joke about it's mostly burping, not farting, but it's methane. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's much more powerful than carbon dioxide. So unless you stop all of that, which we might reduce livestock rearing globally, because it's a cause of a lot of emissions, but we're not going to reduce it to zero. Then Paris says we have to get to a point where the emissions are balanced by sinks. In other words, whatever is left being emitted has to be drawn down. And there's two ways of drawing it down, or negative emissions. One is natural, so through sequestering in soil or growth of biomass, through the natural process of photosynthesis and then not burning or using stuff. And the other is technical, through taking CO2 out of an exhaust pipe of a cement factory or a steel factory, and embedding it in another material or in geologically sequestering it. And there's lots of
carbon capture,
what we call carbon capture in use or storage. And again, there's lots of quite strong views about the extent to which that's possible or necessary. Actually, and you mentioned the Energy Transitions Commission, which I've stepped down from now since I took this role, but still I think continues to be one of the best sources of technical insight. It's a commission with about 50 CEOs, mainly of energy and heavy industry, cement, steel, plastics, etc. So they've been reducing their expectations of what we're really going to need to draw out there. That's why I say for most people it's zero, because we can get to. So for power, we can make all the power we need through means that produce no CO2. So it's not net zero, it's zero. Transport, we can produce all the transport we need through means that either electrified or use green hydrogen. So it's zero, it's not net zero. There are some processes which we don't, steel is challenging, but we think we know how to decarbonize that fully. Some of the, as I say, some of the sort of food production processes. So the first thing is it's about absolute reductions to get as close to zero as possible. And in some cases, there will be a residual where we need to make sure that there are other things happening which offset them, which draw carbon out of the atmosphere so that we do get to zero. Actually, in the second half of the century, we need to get to a point where we're reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, because of course, even at 1.5 degrees average, that's going to be 3 degrees over land. That's already pretty bad news for a lot of parts of the world agriculturally.
True.
So we're gonna need to go, peak at 1.5, and then I think in the decades and centuries to come, be figuring out how to draw more down so we go back to that sort of sweet spot.
Yeah, I don't know if you like the bathtub analogy. I'm reading Bill Gates' book at the moment, Avoiding Climate Disaster, and I see he harks back to the old climate scientists' analogy. If you think of the bathtub, it's like the climate, it's already got too much greenhouse gases. We've got to turn off those taps and we've got to pull the plug. Actually, that's where we're heading.
It's a great analogy,
yeah.
We got it's about stocks and flows. So, but
exactly.
even if we get the flow to zero, we need to reduce the overall stock.
So let's talk about COP26. And if listeners are not familiar with the Paris Agreement on climate change, what happens is that governments set what are called nationally defined contributions. And basically now they're all around net zero by 2050. And it's really interesting with the Americans now back in the Paris Agreement, as I understand it, Nigel, we have about 75% of global GDP from a government perspective now committed to net zero. But it's still very clear governments can't do it alone. We need these other actors, hence the race.
Well, we should just clarify that, as you say, Paris requires countries to set these national plans, and then to revise them every 5 years. That's the reason why COP26 is so important. It's the first test of Paris. Like, will that ratchet process So that when you add up the plans from Paris, they come to like 3.2, 3.4 degrees, like blasting way through the targets. And that was kind of understood, but this is the first test, like, do we come down and how far? And you're right that we have sort of nominal commitments from 70+%, but not detailed. So the US hasn't yet submitted its revised plan, nor has China, nor has India. So there's a lot of diplomacy. The UK said 68%, EU has, the UK said 55% by 2030. So these are the sort of shortish term plans in the context of getting to zero by 2050. But those three major emitters, the biggest emitter in the world, China, the second biggest emitter, USA, and and the most populous country in the world, India, have not. So there's a lot of diplomacy to be done. And then there are some laggards who've, like Australia, who've probably going to be getting a lot of visits from the new special envoy for the Biden administration, John Kerry, because they've been really quite recalcitrant historically and at a national level, although locally and business-wise they've been much more positive. So yeah,
so a lot of work to do.
We've got good headline commitments, but they need to be turned into solid, robust, specific, legally binding commitments in each of those countries.
Right. Okay, so another reason why COP26 is so important, to really up that ambition.
Yeah.
And it also makes it clear that the role of public and private and alignment is essential. How do we get more public and private alignment? And I'm conscious that this is a key feature of Race to Zero, plus other actors, but particularly I'm thinking of alignment between business, investors, and government.
Yeah, I think we always talk about the ambition loop. That if you get again, I use the EVs as an example of how this changes. In 2016, the International Energy Agency was saying we'll still be producing combustion engines in 2080. Then you get like a disruptor like Tesla comes along and shows that you can make cool, fast, sexy electric cars. Then you get countries like the UK and France saying, okay, we're going to phase out combustion engines in 2040, never mind what the IEA says. Then you get Mercedes, the inventor of the commercial combustion engines, say they'll go net zero 2039. Then you get cities like London and Paris and Netherlands saying they don't like all the polluted air, so they're going to go earlier. And you get millions of kids on the street. They're obviously never going to buy a combustion car because they're striking against climate change. Meanwhile, the cost of batteries is coming down compound 20% a year, and that's the main cost driver for electric vehicles. And then last year, even within just 2 years, the UK pulls its date forward by 10 years from 2040 to 2030. And just in the last month, you've had General Motors 2035, Ford Europe 2030, Volvo 2030, as I was saying. So this sort of systemic change of everybody, this is what drives that. And then last month in Germany, 36% of sales of cars were battery cars. Some of them 21% pure battery, 16% hybrid. But and 2 years ago, no one thought that was possible if they were thinking of this linearly. If you're looking for the exponentials, you see that coming. So that ambition loop is what kind of drives alignment once everybody realizes that the transition is inevitable. So that's what we're seeing now. And we're seeing lots of industry groups and lots of governments working on pathways for each sector. And one of Ryan Gonzalo's job is to really try and drive convergence. So if we have the same pathway across lots of governments and lots of the major players in the business, and it just de-risks investment for everybody. And that's what we need to go fast, right? Is for everyone to know that if they commit to that 2025 target, that everyone else is doing that as well, so they're not sticking their head too far above the parapet and having a sort of first move or an early mover disadvantage.
So it seems, I was going to ask you, where do you see the market opportunities and innovations? But we've talked about so many of them already. It's about showing the way. And actually, it's a case of not being left behind if you're a business, it seems, from what you're saying, from renewables to electric vehicles.
I tell you, you look at all the sectors that are already really moving, and there's blood all over the walls from people who thought that because they've been in the sector for 40, 50 years, they understood the dynamic. And that's a real danger. People who've been in an industry for a long time are often cognitively really anchored in the past. If you're an old car guy, most of them are guys, Mary Barrett, if you're an old car CEO and you've been in the industry for 40 years, you're kind of in love with a combustion engine. It's really hard cognitively to imagine that within 10 years, no one is going to care about your beautiful combustion engines because no one's going to want them. So it's going to be a question of like personal identity, really having to let go of the fact that I'm a combustion engine person to I'm an industrial leader, and my job now is to manage a transition, which means letting go of my self-identity and identity of the company, which is 100 years old. So you think of all these industries, you know, cars over 100 years, cement 2,000 years, steel, I don't know, 3,000. These are old industries. They're not, and they're not used to that kind of rapid. So that's one of the hardest things. And as I always say, if you get behind on something that's going exponential, and I talk about EVs a lot because that's the industry, the automotive industry is the one I worked in. I hear a lot of CEOs saying privately, you know, shit, we wish we'd started 10 years earlier, because there's a learning curve, right? And you can, unless you're aiming for the exponential, you aim for where you think your competitors are now. By the time you get there, they've doubled again. So it's really challenging. So I think
that's a really strong message for those CEOs and CFOs with us this morning.
It's pretty much every sector, right? I mean, I kind of defy the audience to name a sector that isn't going to go through a major disruption in the next 10 years.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to supply chains. So we're seeing a lot of large businesses and a lot of collaboration starting to push ass on their suppliers, upstream and downstream, to decarbonize. We're seeing things like shadow prices being used, for example, by Microsoft and others. Do you feel that at the moment there is a real untapped opportunity here that business really needs to jump on, particularly big businesses?
Well, I mean, we know that most businesses, 80 to 90% of the emissions are in the either upstream or downstream, depending, so in the suppliers, but also in the product in use. So there's both a supply chain issue and then a product and service design issue. I mean, retailers are the classics. So Amazon or Walmart, two biggest retailers in the world, 90% of their emissions. Now they're both committed to net zero. So if you're in their supply chain and you're not committed to net zero, you're just waiting for a knock on the door from the buyer saying you're off the list. I remember as a young factory manager, when I was making all the brake linings for Volvo trucks, and I remember the Volvo auditor, when he asked the first question about, have you got you thought about environmental management plan, ISO 14001, and I guess I was a kind of quite green factory manager, so I said no, but we will do by next time. So they came back the next year and they asked the question again. Said, yeah, we're thinking of, we're kind of interested to know when you're going. So instead of have you thought about it, it was like, when are you going to have it? And I said, oh well, we've already decided, we've already done the work, we're going to have it within 2 years. Then they come back the next year and we were the first plant in the group to have that, and they were like, okay, well that's good, because we're going to make this a procurement requirement in 2 years time. So, and that's the way we all work in procurement, right? We give people an indication of the direction we're going in, and then over a period of a few years that becomes a procurement requirement. So actually it's a really great opportunity for people in SMEs in global supply chains to innovate, to win market share, right? And I remember when you mentioned CDP, I did some work with Walmart like 14 years ago, when they started looking at, they realized only 10% of their emissions were in their own operations, sort of stores and transport basically. So they would have to engage with suppliers, and we did a little pilot with about 30 suppliers, and it was the smaller suppliers who engaged much more positively with it because they saw it as an opportunity, whereas the big suppliers were a bit like, Walmart.
And they're agile. That's great.
And they're agile. We know that, right? Often the innovation comes from the SMEs. So I think it's a great opportunity for agile businesses of all types, but particularly SMEs.
Okay, fantastic. Let's move on to finance. So we can definitely see that investors are becoming one of the most demanding voices from a climate change perspective, and of course wider environmental, social governance, so-called ESG issues. Disclosure via schemes like CDP are standard. The TCFD climate finance disclosure is going to be a big topic for discussion at COP26. We see all over the press in Europe today about the sustainable finance regulations that are coming down the road, the SFDR this month, to regulate the financial industry and their packages of what is sustainable and green and so forth. What does good look like if you're a business nowadays from the investor perspective with all that going on?
Well, first thing to say is that investors are always the slowest to spot trends, right? And so we've got to get over this idea that they're the masters of the universe, because they have been the last to the party. And then within investors, it's kind of got asset owners, then asset managers, then banks. So there's a lovely, if any of you are interested, Christiana Figueras, who presided over the Paris negotiations, and Tom Carnac and Paul Dickinson, the founder of CDP, have a lovely podcast called Outrage and Optimism.
I'm a fan.
Yeah, and they
and you're often on it.
They interviewed Oliver Beta, who's the CEO of Allianz, and this is about a year ago, and they asked him what he thought of Larry Fink's latest letter, sort of ratcheting up pressure, and he just laughed and said, "Welcome to the party, Larry." You know, so a bit late. So and banks are really starting to wake up now. So I think for businesses, you're starting to see this is becoming an issue of cost of capital and of attraction of shareholders. So the rating agencies have downgraded some of the American oil majors who've not been engaging with this seriously enough, so their cost of capital's just gone up.
Yeah.
And I was on the board of the London pension. I mean, every pension fund now is seeing this, and this is there's one message I like to get. This is not a green issue or an ESG issue. It's a fundamental strategic issue about a secular change in our economy, which you can't avoid. There's no head in the sand. There's no King Canute. This is happening. The UNPRI, this massive group of investors, have published some work, and I think they're just updating it maybe this week. They call it inevitable policy response, which just lays out the forecast of just how disruptive changes in policy are going to be. And again, it's a sort of so this is not about trade-offs, right? You don't get to decide not to do this. If you don't do this, then you are choosing not to participate in future markets.
Yeah.
There's no safe haven where you can just hunker down and be a coal person or a combustion engine person or a intensive meat production person. All those industries are being disrupted to zero.
Yeah.
Or to niche. It's like I mean, we still have sort of steamroller fates on Sundays in the summer where a few people in flat caps burn coal and drive steamrollers, right? If you want to base your industry on that future, then it's going to be a very small niche.
And of course, the financial services sector wants to manage risk. They want to avoid stranding. They want to increase their return in this new economy. So all the incentives are there for them as well. So yeah, business needs to bear all that in mind. So as you mentioned, the Outrage and Optimism podcast with the amazing Christiana Figueres, as you say, she's the architect of the Paris Agreement. If anybody out there hasn't listened, it is fun and it's very informative. You had a recent Race to Zero feature in that podcast, and you talked about not being optimistic on the global finance that needs to be mobilized, particularly for climate resilience. And I know today so far we've been talking mostly about what we in sustainability call mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But you talk about a 4 trillion per annum figure that is needed. Talk to us about that and why you're not optimistic on that.
Well, I think I said I'm less optimistic.
Okay, less optimistic.
Which is why I'm putting more effort into this now. So yes, I think we have really good momentum on the race to zero. I mean, generally speaking, business leaders, finance leaders, government leaders have understood that this is inevitable and that and desirable, and are leaning into it. Still not enough momentum, but you can see that ratchet process happening all the time, and a lot of people, a lot of really smart people, really focused on it. The Paris Agreement is a 3-legged stool that says we've got to get to zero, but we've also got to address the need to invest in more resilience in many communities around the world who face heightened risk because of the amount of climate change that's already locked in, that we're already seeing and will get worse because there's a time lag. And it talks about the means of implementation, which mainly means money, right? That's what I'm saying. We're in a weird geopolitical time now. It doesn't, in many ways, economically, we're in a sort of post-World War type scenario where there's been massive economic damage and massive loss of life because of COVID. And remember, after World War II, there was a need to massively inject money into the European economy, in particular, to get the economy back up and running and to reduce the risk of conflict. I mean, then the sort of American judgment was based on a concern over a red tide. That's why they invested in the Marshall Plan. So I think that, we face an issue about the deployment of vaccines in the global south, a lot of very vulnerable communities and economies, lots of people gone back into extreme poverty. a lot of countries with no fiscal headroom, so the issues of debt relief and enhanced issuance of special drawing rights at the global level. And yes, delivering on the 100 billion, which is a negotiated commitment from the global north to global south per year. But as you say, the actual figure from the Vivid Economics and the World Bank that needs to be spent on mitigation and resilience in the global south, so in sort of middle income and least developed countries, is 4 trillion a year. So even if we get 100 billion or 150 billion of public finance, that's not enough. So I think we do need to pay a lot more attention to how do we leverage public finance in those countries, which is why I was in Kenya last week talking with the central bank and the treasury and a lot of private sector players from Africa and from institutional investors in Europe, and actually particularly in the UK, because there's plenty of money around, but it's got to be deployed in the right places. And to do that, you have to the right conditions have to. It's not just you can't just throw money at it. It's got to be de-risked enough so that there's enough confidence in the return so that it will flow at enough scale.
Yeah. Okay. And, it's fascinating with all of the economic analyses that have been done over the years and very recently on the cost of tackling climate change. You and I and many others know on this call, it's much cheaper to tackle climate change than to deal with the costs. The costs we're already seeing: increased storms, wildfires, droughts, crop failures, exactly as you're describing, particularly in the global south. Do you think that is actually understood yet, that it's actually cheaper to deal with it?
Not universally. I mean, a lot of people still think of this as a cost and forget that the counterfactual is catastrophe. Right, so it's like, yes, it's going to cost. We're going to have to invest more. I was talking with Chris Stark, who runs the UK's Climate Change Committee, yesterday. We need to invest in the UK about 50 billion a year, which is significantly more than currently. But there's a return on that investment. So again, the recent decision to bring forward the transition to electric vehicles has a macroeconomic return. So yeah, we have to spend more money on charging infrastructure up front, but we'll save a massive amount of money because electric cars are much more efficient. Also, by the way, we get more energy independence because we don't have to import foreign oil. So that if you think about all the wars of last century, many of them were about access to oil. Right. Well, if you don't rely on Middle Eastern oil, then you don't need to prosecute wars there to secure that supply. Right. So it totally changes the geopolitics and the costs, and those wars have cost very dear in human lives, but also in trillions of dollars.
Economics.
Right? Yeah.
Let's flip the conversation a little bit. Let's think about us as human beings, because all this sounds very big and very scale and very game changing. And European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has a wonderful phrase that she talks about when she talks about the EU Green Deal, that here in Ireland, we're all signed up to that. She calls that, which is our post-COVID green recovery for climate change, biodiversity, circular economy, and so forth. She says that is Europe's man on the moon moment to be net zero emissions by 2050. But to me, when she talks about that, it really illustrates how significant the scale of change needed is. Do you think just that fact is a barrier, our ability as humans to get this?
I think I should have a word with Ursula. We maybe should call it our woman on Mars moment rather than reinforce 1960s
right here, right now. I love that. I love that. Yeah, love it.
Yeah, but it's a very apposite analogy, right? I just read last summer a history of the moon landings just to try and understand that. It's really important. First of all, Kennedy didn't say we're going to land on the moon because he wanted to land on the moon. He said we're going to land on the moon because he was frightened that Russia had taken a leap ahead of America, technically and industrially. So it was about committing to something which would drive innovation and economic competitiveness. We talk about the Sputnik moment. That's the moment when you realize your competitors are way ahead of you. I mean, not just a little bit ahead of you, but way ahead of you. And you're like, oh my God, if we don't really deploy a lot of our resources, then they're going to keep going ahead of us. And second of all, most people thought he was mad and it was impossible. So the best mathematicians in MIT told him, you can't do that. We can't do that because we don't even have the mathematics to calculate an orbital trajectory for a lunar lander. And he didn't say, oh, that's a shame, let's give up then. He said, I don't care. We're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade, figure out the maths.
Yeah.
So they did within 2 years, right? So I think this is something that we have to remember, that engineers and scientists love an impossible challenge. They're incredibly innovative. You tell an engineer to halve the weight or to double the speed or to give them an unrealistic, then that's what creates, that's what drives the innovative juices of engineers. So this is much bigger than a landing on the moon, because that was about one prototype. Basically, this is about the whole of society transforming. But nevertheless, the analogy is really valid, because it's about saying we're going to get there, whatever, we have to get there. We can't contemplate not getting there. So let's just accept that and use that to drive innovation. I mentioned that earlier, that actually we could get there faster. So in the Climate Change Committee in the UK is globally respected as one of the best sort of think tanks about how do we actually get there. It was set up as part of the Climate Change Act to sit outside of the political cycle. So they've just made recommendations to the UK on the sixth carbon budget, which is what's got us to 68% reduction in our NDC by 2030. But this is the first time that they had to do that in the context of a legal target of 0 by 2050, which the previous Parliament had made as a commitment. So in their report, they look at various scenarios, and they've chosen the central scenario, which gets to net zero by 2050. But they also look at what would happen if technology moved faster. And they said, actually, the UK, and I think this applies to any mature economy, could get to net zero by 2042 if the technology moves faster. So my view would be, why don't we back our engineers to get there 10 years earlier? So I think that's what will gradually happen, is that we've got a big ratchet going on right now, focused on 2050, and gradually, people are really, like Amazon are committed to 2040. Many of I don't know what Dublin's commitment is, but many major cities are committed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Earlier.
Ireland's is net zero by 2050 for Ireland, and we put that into law.
Right, but many people are now, Scotland's is 2045.
And the Climate Pledge 2040, Amazon and Co.
2040. The National Farmers Union in the UK say they could get there by 2040. The Biden administration is pushing for the US grid to be net zero by 2035. In the EU, they're working on, you in the EU, we can say that now, are working on legislation
We're not holding it against you,
to phase out combustion engine trucks by 2050. I was on a call with the commissioner just last week. The European trucking industry's already said they'll get there by 2040. So things are changing so fast that policies, with the best of intention, are already, in some cases, becoming out of date. Yeah. So I think we'll end up getting there in the early 40s, if not the late 30s.
Okay. So I'm conscious of time. I'm conscious of people wanting to get in this terrific discussion. If you have questions, keep popping them into the chat box. My colleague Amy is keeping an eye on that for me. Nigel, just as we have a look at that, it sounds to me that you are optimistic about COP26. You're optimistic about the challenges ahead and the ability to meet them. Am I reading that right?
Yes.
Good. You're the right man for this job. It's a very important job. And if you're a business listening today, you've not set greenhouse gas emissions targets yet, you've really not got on board, what would you say to that business?
Well, first of all, you're non-compliant with your legal framework, because if you're in the EU or the UK, then you've got a legal framework which is going to force you to get to net zero by 2050. So wake up, right? Because it's coming. Okay, you may not be literally legally non-compliant, but you're out of kilter with the legal framework which your countries are committed to, and which both where you are and where you're operating and selling. So but the first things you can do are, I would go action first, analysis second here. That might sound a bit funny, but there's a couple of things which are just no-brainers. Just commit to 100% renewable energy, get onto your electricity supplier and find a green tariff, and just do that tomorrow.
Yeah, and it does not cost more. I can just put that out there. It doesn't. That's a myth.
Second of all, commit to transitioning your entire vehicle fleet to electric vehicles within 5 or 10 years. If you want help to do that, there's 2 great initiatives which the Climate Group run. One called RE100, over 200 companies well down that track of moving to 100% renewables. They can help you. There's different challenges in different markets. It's not always easy in some markets. And EV100, which is similar, about many companies have already committed to decarbonising their fleet. For many of you, those will be 2 of the biggest sources of emissions. The third thing I would say is, if you're in a heavy emitting industry like shipping, or I see there's a question about shipping or cement, then find the collaborative initiatives which are within your industry and join them if you haven't already. There's an amazing shipping initiative called Getting to Zero, which has worked on a whole pathway for how the shipping industry gets. And again, that's that about moving safely in a pack to go there much faster without having to stick your neck out. So as I say, I would get into action first and analysis second, because you can use a lot of time with the excuse that it's really hard to understand and all the data's not there and blah, blah, blah. That's all true, but don't spend 3 years doing analysis when there's some easy things you can do to get into action.
Absolutely.
There's organizations like We Mean Business and the International Chamber of Commerce and the World Business Council who are all, so lots of people there who can help you. But you will have to do the analysis and understand what your emissions are, because you will be required to report on them. Mandatory disclosure to your investors is coming. Of course, it depends if you're an SME or a listed company, or how on your size and everything. So I would say get into action first, and then think about your analysis and your disclosure second. Otherwise, you'll lose 3 years of learning. And the most important learning is about what to do, and your analysis will help refine that. But there's some things that are obvious for everybody.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to move on to questions. We have tons of questions in the chat box. We're coming to you guys, but we also have a number of questions that came in advance. So let me start off with some of those. Tesco Ireland have asked, what are the key opportunities and challenge for businesses in embedding climate change into the business strategy? We've talked a lot about that, Nigel. If you had to say one thing, what would you say is the key opportunity?
Well, I'll give you 3: cost reduction, market share growth, and talent attraction and retention.
Absolutely.
If you don't have a good strategy now, you're not going to attract good graduates. They're going to say, where's your climate change plan? Where's your commitment to net zero? Why are you saying 2050, not 2040? I mean, the smartest graduates are on the case. So there you go: cost reduction, market share growth, and a fourth one would be driving innovation.
Okay, excellent. Danone have asked, currently everything and everyone is talking about climate action. How do we continue beyond 2021 and COP26?
Well, first of all, Danone know more about this than I do. They're a very sophisticated company doing amazing work in making the transition.
We have a lot of those on the call today. Let's have a
economy. But it's a really good point, right? So I think first thing is to a certain extent, I think we have to accept that there is a rhythm to attention, and that's built into the Paris mechanism. So, but I think. I think that there won't be as much global attention on COP27, which is going to be in Africa next year, as there is on COP26, because it doesn't have that such a high international profile. But I think that I do think one of the things we're trying to do in Glasgow is really shift the focus from all the long-term targets to what are we doing in the next 5 years, and I do think that that's something which particularly sort of B2C companies can use to really engage with their millions of customers by telling the story of the progress that they're making, what they're committed to, and how it affects. And I think the interesting thing about the food sector, of course, is this is about climate and biodiversity very much hand in hand. And in many ways, the nature narrative is an easier one to engage with most people on, because it feels less abstract than climate. So I would say, embedding it in your business model and embed it on your consumer-facing communication, so that one of the challenges with ordinary citizens is it's very hard to feel any agency on this. It's so big, it's so overwhelming. I'm just one of 8 billion people. But I think if B2C companies can, in their consumer communication and their advertising, help give people a sense that through their decisions of what to eat, what to buy, they are contributing, they have some agency, and they are contributing to this regenerative future that we're all trying to build.
Yes, give the consumer power. Absolutely. Okay, we have an excellent question from our climate finance division in the Ministry of Finance here in Ireland. And it's asking, how can Ireland and the UK build on their strong links to further develop the sustainability agenda in the run-up to COP26?
Great question. I mean, I think there's some really solid building blocks, and forgive me for not, no, you know, I'm not, I've got a reasonable idea of what the UK is doing, but I'm not so familiar with what Ireland's doing. But I think I think again, it's one of the things where the convergence is really helpful. So, you know, converging on making TCFD disclosure mandatory, you know, convergence on issuing green bonds, convergence on embedding climate change into the mandate of central bank, convergence on stopping the use of export credits to invest in fossil fuels overseas. Those kind of, you know, international convergence on international standards of putting climate change into every financial decision are really helpful. And I think increasingly they're as asset owners in particular realize there's a, you know, who often think of themselves as universal owners, like they're invested in the whole economy. I think increasingly they realize that those kind of moves are the ones which de-risk economies and make it more likely they're invest in those economies and in companies that are investing in those economies. Okay. I mean, there are other things like, you know, that I think we need more kind of green investment banks, so that there's a, you know, that's the kind of thing that national governments can do to help really direct the infrastructure spend into the infrastructure that is going to deliver the zero carbon future, and not infrastructure that's going to lock in. And the last thing I say is just to be really front and center about the job creation capability, and particularly in any COVID recovery measures, you know, like to make sure that we've got smart conditionality around COVID recovery measures. So we're not just investing in the old technology and the old economy, and we know that, you know, every $1 million invested in the green economy is going to generate 3 times as many jobs as investing in the brown. So, you know, with jobs and economic recovery front and center of every Treasury's responsibility, then tilting all the recovery towards future jobs rather than old jobs which will become stranded jobs is going to be really important.
Absolutely. And I think there's a very interesting one where we punch above our weight here in Ireland with respect to renewable energy. We're already coming up on 40% of renewables on our very modern grid, and it's an island of Ireland grid. So it's a north-south air grid. And we have a target to be 70% renewables by 2030. Mostly the investment has been in onshore wind, offshore, a huge amount of planning going on to implementation funding. It's a great example of policy, capital markets coming together and enabling that. So that, I think, has been already a really nice example where we've had good engagement across the island. Okay, I'm getting to some of these amazing questions that have come in the chat box. So a great one from Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland asking about the recent International Energy Agency study that showed global emissions rebounded already post-COVID. We saw that recently in the news to 2019 levels. And that's despite all of this talk of a green recovery and so forth post-pandemic. And the question is, should we be looking at the more immediate term in terms of demonstrable action rather than this focus on the long term, the net zero 2050, to really get traction because of that fact?
I mean, absolutely. As I say, the focus should be on actions in the next 5 years consistent with getting to zero. We can talk about the 2040s forever, but if we don't act now, by 2030 it's too late.
Yeah.
So yes, and so I think we're that's why we've launched these we've launched these race to zero breakthroughs, which are focused on the next 5 to 10 years, because those are the conversations we will be having in Glasgow. Is what are people doing now? What are they doing next year? So it's really an action COP rather than an abstract long-term planning COP.
Right. So it's now 2021 to 2030. It is this decade in terms of those low carbon pathways. Okay. And we have some great comments in about greenwashing, obviously to be avoided at all costs. What we're talking about here is credible, rigorous action. But the whole concept of net zero versus Zero, zero, the real zero is being made very well here. And absolutely, that's the truth. And I think we covered that when we were talking about what is net zero.
And for businesses, that the gold standard is a science-based targets initiative. That's what is very much embedded in the race to zero, and they require people to reduce emissions in line with the science and only rely on offsets for any residual emissions at the end of that journey. That doesn't stop people buying high quality offsets now in addition to the reductions, but it's not an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. And we couldn't agree more here. We're very big fans in Davy about the science-based target initiative. And I would add to a 1.5 degree scenario. Yeah. Very, very important.
And that's what you need to do to join the race to zero. So that'll be. I should have said that first, shouldn't I? Given that it's a campaign that I'm running, is that the first action everyone should take is join the race to zero.
Very good. Okay. What progress are we seeing in the shipping industry? And you mentioned this briefly. Can you tell a little bit more? We've had quite a breakthrough there.
Really interesting. So first of all, there's a great collaborative initiative called the Getting to Zero initiative, which is run by the International Maritime Organization and the Global Maritime Forum. Get my three-letter acronyms wrong. As part of the Mission Possible platform, which is a partnership between the Energy Transitions Commission, the World Economic Forum, Rocky Mountain Institute, and We Mean Business. So they're working on a pathway. And they've just agreed that that 5% of international shipping needs to be zero carbon by 2030. That doesn't sound very ambitious, but you have to design, build, test, and deploy the ships. And we haven't got any international ships that are net zero at the moment. The interesting story there is Maersk, who just 2 years ago committed to be net zero by 2050, biggest container shipping company in the world. And as a result of that, they said, we've got to have our first net zero ships on the water by 2030. They just, I think last week, said, okay, they've just moved that forward to 2023. So again, once you start taking this seriously and the innovation starts flowing, it's amazing how fast we can go. So but I would look at the Getting to Zero coalition, which is really strong. They've done some really good work. We've been working closely with them to help sort of align the pathway there.
Perfect. And purely because of time, we can't take any more questions. Fantastic questions, and I sincerely thank everybody who has joined for their enthusiasm and really informed questions. And we are very happy to come back to you in Davy on any of those we couldn't answer today. Nigel, sincere thanks for speaking today. It's always a pleasure. It's so informative, and I wish you every success as you continue around the world on the race to zero and at COP26 in November. Great. And I just want to give to everybody a couple of key takeaway messages that I've certainly seen from this discussion. Number one, net zero by latest 2050. It is the target everybody's framing around. We've talked about all the actions that have to happen this decade to get us there. Government can't do it alone. Business in every sector needs to step up and be part of the solution if we're going to get that 1.5 Celsius future. And this presents a major opportunity and a major source of competitive advantage. And we've talked about some great examples today. So this decade, it's all about net zero pledges, lots of net zero pledges we're hearing about, but they need to turn into credible action to deliver. And if you're not yet engaged, the Race to Zero campaign we've been talking about is an excellent entry point, and there's plenty of resources that can support you. And from us here in Davy Horizons, we will follow up with all of you with the white paper, also the video of this session. Please feel free to share it because we're really trying to raise awareness. But all of the things we've talked about today, the different examples that Nigel has given, we've got all the URLs and so forth to that and to the Race for Zero, so you can get follow-up from that. And by all means, come back to us if we can be any help as well. So thank you so much to everybody and look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks so much, Dorothy. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, Nigel.